Some Final Fantasy bosses can survive your best strategy for 20 minutes and still barely blink. The fights on this list aren't dangerous because of raw damage, they're dangerous because they punish the exact habits that carried you through the rest of the game. Nobody agrees on which one truly deserves the top spot, but everyone agrees on which one made them consider putting the controller down for good. Omega, Final Fantasy V. The safest move in Final Fantasy is usually to hit the boss as hard as you can, as fast as you can. Against Omega, that instinct is the fastest way to lose. This is a fight where the obvious plan gets punished on principle. Omega counters aggression with brutal retaliation, the kind that turns a confident, all-out assault into a party wipe before you even understand what triggered it. Players walk in expecting a damage race. They walk out realizing the damage race was never the game being played. Omega sits at 55,530 HP, a number that sounds almost reasonable on paper. It isn't. The health bar barely moves, while careless attacks get punished one at a time, and that gap between the number and the reality is the whole trick. You cannot outlevel a lesson. What Omega actually tests is whether you understand the systems underneath the numbers. Careless physical attacks get punished. Sloppy formations get punished. The habits that carried you through 30 hours of random encounters get identified and dismantled, one counterattack at a time. Veterans with hundreds of hours in the series still get humbled here, because the fight isn't asking what your characters can do, it's asking what you've actually learned. That's why Omega keeps showing up near the top of hardest boss conversations decades later, not because it hits like a truck, because it forces precise, deliberate play in a genre that usually rewards just pushing forward. Picture the version of you at 2 a.m., thumb hovering over the attack command out of pure habit, watching that huge health total barely dent while your own party gets torn apart for the crime of playing normally. That's the real fight, not the monster on screen, the instinct you can't switch off fast enough. Power in this series was never just a big number waiting to be worn down. Sometimes it's a boss that makes your own reflexes the enemy. But punishing your instincts is one thing. The next fight barely cares what you do at all, because it's built like a wall so thick that even perfect play means chipping away at something that refuses to notice you're there. Emerald Weapon. You can build the perfect party, run the perfect strategy, execute every command without a single mistake, and still watch that health bar barely move while a clock quietly kills you anyway. That is Emerald Weapon. Sitting on the ocean floor between Junon and Costa del Sol, waiting under the water for someone arrogant enough to think leveling up was the hard part. The fight everyone remembers first is the underwater time limit, and it deserves the reputation. You are not just fighting a boss, you are fighting a countdown that does not care how well you play. Miss the window and the encounter simply ends, no dramatic death, no cool finishing move, just failure by clock. Where the last fight punished bad instincts in real time, this one punishes decisions you made hours before you ever loaded the save. The surface read is that Emerald Weapon is just a bigger, meaner damage sponge, another number to chip away at. That undersells what the fight actually demands. Players spend real hours before the encounter even starts, farming materia combinations, building specific damage limits, stacking defensive setups designed around one single monster. The fight itself becomes almost secondary to the homework required to survive it. That is the twist buried in Emerald Weapon's reputation. Preparation became the actual boss. The tentacles, the attacks, the sheer scale of the thing, all of that is just the final exam. The studying happened long before the water ever closed over your head. And somewhere in a dark living room, some poor soul watched hours of grinding evaporate because they misjudged one timer, and had to decide whether to try again or walk away for good. The community argument that never dies is Emerald versus Ruby, and it never resolves clean. Some players swear Ruby's four-limbed onslaught makes Emerald look tame by comparison. Others insist nothing compares to racing a clock while an ocean's worth of power tries to end your run in seconds. Party setup decides the answer. Materia strategy decides the answer. Whether you value raw punishment over pressure decides the answer. Nobody agrees, and that is sort of the point. Emerald Weapon gets cited constantly as one of the fights that define the whole idea of the post-game bragging rights superboss. The optional monster you fight purely to prove you understood every system the game gave you. No plot demands it, no ending requires it, you do it because the game quietly dared you to, and once you know that, you cannot unknow it. And optimization has a dark side. The next boss doesn't just reward a well-built party, it exposes exactly how deeply you understood the game's systems, turning your own character building into the difference between surviving a turn and dying instantly. Omega Weapon. Beat every boss in Final Fantasy VIII the normal way, and you will still walk into this fight and lose in under a minute. That is not an exaggeration for effect. Omega Weapon is the game's ultimate optional super boss, and it is not designed to test whether you finish the story. It is designed to test whether you actually understood the machine running underneath it. Most players never do. They junction their spells to their stats, they level up like every other Final Fantasy, and they walk in expecting a hard version of a normal fight. Omega Weapon does not do normal fights. The damage output is brutal enough that community rankings put it near the top of the series' most absurdly difficult optional bosses, and the preparation required to even survive the opening exchanges goes far beyond anything the main campaign ever demands. Exact numbers get argued about endlessly, but nobody argues about the outcome. Underprepared parties get erased. Here's the part that turns this into more than just a stat check. Final Fantasy VIII runs on the junction system, magic bound directly to your stats, and most players use it the way the tutorial suggests. Omega Weapon does not care what the tutorial suggests. Survive this fight and you have almost certainly bent the junction system somewhere it was never meant to bend, stacking the right spells on the right stats in ways that push a character's numbers past what the campaign ever asks for. The fight does not reward good play, it rewards knowing the exploit. And that is exactly where the community splits in half. One side calls this legitimate mastery, the deepest possible expression of a system built for exactly this kind of experimentation. The other side calls it something closer to cheating the test, using the answer key the designers accidentally left in the room. Nothing in the game confirms which reading is correct, but the pattern speaks for itself. Every reliable strategy traces back to junction combinations the campaign never teaches and never expects you to find. Picture the version of this fight that ends badly. Hours into a save file, favorite characters junction the way the game seemed to want, health bar barely moving while the timer keeps running. That is not a skill issue. That is a player who played the game exactly as intended, walking straight into a fight that punishes exactly that. Compare that to Diablo's, and the bar just moved somewhere uglier. Preparation alone does not save you here. Understanding is no longer optional, it is the entire fight. And the line between mastering a system and abusing one gets blurrier every time someone actually wins. But at least those fights felt like they belonged in their worlds. The next one barely feels like a creature at all. It feels like an abstract exam dropped into the game, punishing you for reasons that never quite make sense. Ozma. Final Fantasy IX. Ozma does not look like a boss. It looks like a mistake the developers forgot to delete, a small floating orb hovering in a blank white void that has no business existing inside a game about crystals and summoners and airships. There is no throne room. There is no music that swells to warn you. There is just white, and then there is Ozma. That is the point. Every fight before this one could be cracked with enough hours and enough note-taking. Level up, learn the pattern, bring the right gear, win. Ozma is where that logic quietly stops working, and it stops working on purpose. The official story is simple. You find an optional door, you walk through it, you fight a hidden super boss, same as every other Final Fantasy game before and after it. Except nothing about the encounter plays by the rules the rest of Final Fantasy IX spent 40 hours teaching you. 40 hours of the game training you to trust levels, trust gear, trust preparation, and then handing you a fight that treats all three like a suggestion. Players walk in expecting a giant monster with a face and a weakness. They get an abstract shape with no visible pattern, throwing out threats that punish the exact strategies that carried them through the rest of the game. Overleveled parties get humbled. Careful, methodical players get blindsided. The fight rewards specific preparation and specific knowledge far more than raw stats, to the point where undergeared characters with the right setup can outperform maxed out ones who walked in blind. Bring your best team in cold, and you can lose faster than a party half its level with the right plan. That is what makes Ozma so unsettling to talk about. It is consistently ranked among the most infamous fights in the entire franchise, not because it hits like a truck, but because it feels like it is grading you. Nobody can quote you its exact health total or its full resistance list with confidence, and that vagueness is not an accident of memory, it is the fight's whole personality. You are not solving a monster, you are sitting an exam with no syllabus, and nobody handed out the textbook beforehand. Look back at what the last few bosses demanded. Effort, patience, pattern recognition, the willingness to learn a system until it obeyed you. Ozma takes that entire idea and quietly revokes it. It genuinely plays less like a creature and more like the game itself deciding whether you deserve to move forward, and that reading holds up precisely because everyone who has fought it describes it the same way, not as a monster, but as a test, not a fight you win, a fight you pass. Picture the version of you at 2 a.m. who has already beaten 3 of these things through sheer stubbornness. Controller warm in your hands, convinced that knowledge always wins eventually. Ozma is the fight that quietly asks whether that was ever fully true, because if the strangest boss in the game can shrug off preparation itself, mastery was never really the finish line. It was just the entry fee, and some doors don't care how much you paid to open them. Some fights don't even have the decency to end quickly when you get them wrong. Some of them just keep going, minute after minute, turning the act of finally winning into something closer to survival, the kind of fight you don't walk away from feeling triumphant. You walk away feeling like you got out alive. Penance. Final Fantasy X. Penance doesn't kill you in one move. It kills you an hour and 40 minutes into the fight when your thumb slips for half a second and every bit of progress evaporates. That's the whole horror of it. The last boss made the game feel like it was cheating in real time, throwing out scripted attacks designed to end runs instantly. Penance doesn't need any of that. It doesn't need to cheat. It just needs to outlast you. And it is very, very good at outlasting you. Officially, Penance is the ultimate optional super boss bolted onto the endgame, the final checkbox, for anyone who cleared the story and wanted a real reason to keep playing. That sounds like a badge of honor, something you slap on a resume of gaming achievements. In practice, it's less of a fight and more of a sentence you agree to serve when you hand yourself with a controller in both hands. There's no burst phase to memorize here, no single scripted attack that ends the run in an instant, no one moment you can point to and say that's the killer. Instead, the entire encounter is built around depletion, chipping away at a health pool so massive that players talk about the fight in terms of hours instead of turns. Preparation matters more than reaction time. Party setup matters more than reflexes. The forums and guides built around Penance read less like strategy and more like packing lists for an expedition, because that's exactly what the fight actually demands, and that's where it turns cruel. An hour in, hands cramped, focus finally cracking, one mistimed input can unravel the entire attempt. Not because the boss punished you instantly, but because it waited until you were tired enough to punish yourself. Penance doesn't beat you. It just waits around long enough for you to beat yourself. Fans still argue about whether that makes Penance a masterpiece of design or just a war of attrition dressed up as a boss fight. But look at how consistently the fight gets described. Nobody talks about a dangerous pattern to dodge. Everybody talks about stamina, focus, and whether they can survive their own exhaustion long enough to survive the boss's health bar. That's not an accident of design. That's the entire point of the encounter, baked in on purpose. Somewhere out there right now is the couch, the barely moving health bar, and the quiet argument in someone's head about whether quitting now means the last 2 hours meant nothing, but Penance can still be measured in a single sitting. The next fight abandons even that mercy, stretching into something so absurdly long that finishing it stops being a boss battle and starts being an act of sheer exhausting commitment. Yasmat, Final Fantasy XII. Yasmat does not kill you, it outlasts you, which is somehow so much worse. There is no burst combo here, no cheap one-shot, no gimmick to memorize, no secret pattern hiding in the animations. Yasmat is a wall of health that you chip away with the same 3 attacks over and over, and the fight simply refuses to end. Where Penance demanded everything you had in one brutal sitting, Yasmat takes that same idea and stretches it past the point of reason. This is not a boss fight anymore, it is a shift. Players routinely gear up, set their attacks on repeat, and walk away from the television entirely. They go make food, they go to work, they come back hours later and find the health bar has barely moved. That is the entire strategy, in full. Not skill, not reflexes, not clever positioning, just time. Raw, uncomfortable, real-world time, the kind you do not get back no matter how many hours you sink into the couch. That is the joke and the dread rolled into one single fight. You are not fighting a monster. You are fighting your own evening, and the monster is just there to keep score. Nobody remembers a clever mechanic that beat them here. They remember the couch, the clock, and the creeping realization that quitting now means the last stretch of chipping meant absolutely nothing. That is the same 2 a.m. math every super boss in this video eventually forces on you, the quiet negotiation between your patience and your ego. Yasmat just strips away every excuse you could possibly hide behind. There is no puzzle to solve. There is only the question, of whether you actually care enough to sit there and see it through. And the cruelest part is that Yzmat is completely beatable. 0 unfair tricks, 0 unbeatable phases, 0 moments where the game is secretly cheating you. The only real boss stat that matters here is how much of your finite free time you are willing to hand over for a victory screen. Some players treat it like a badge of honor, others quietly admit it broke something in them that no dragon or god ever managed to. That is what makes Yzmat such a strange kind of legendary. It is not feared for its danger, it is feared for its sheer, exhausting length, remembered less as a fight and more as an event people survived and lived to tell friends about, and yet Yzmat at least feels like a legendary event, something worth bragging about at the end. The next wall drops that grandeur entirely, becoming a colossal chore you grind not for glory, but because the post-game quietly demands it over and over. Longai. A giant tortoise should not be the fight that makes grown players question their life choices, but Longai does exactly that, and it does not need a single flashy attack to do it. This thing does not kill you with power, it kills you with time. Longai shows up deep in Final Fantasy XIII's post-game, wandering the Arshilt steppe like an oversized lawn ornament that happens to house one of the cruelest damage checks in the series. The surface pitch sounds almost boring. Big shell, huge health pool, slow and lumbering. The kind of enemy you'd expect to fall over if you just kept swinging. That surface red does not survive contact with the actual fight. Final Fantasy XIII built its whole combat identity around the stagger system, that rising meter that turns a tanky brick into a burst damage piñata for a few precious seconds. Every boss in this video has tested some piece of that system. Emerald and Omega Weapon demanded you prepare for it. Ozma demanded you understand a fight you could not even see. Long Gui demands something colder than all of that. It demands you run the exact same perfect cycle, stagger, burst, rebuild, stagger again, over and over, for as long as it takes, without your focus ever slipping once. Miss the stagger window and the meter resets. Get greedy with your paradigm shifts and the cycle collapses. One lapse in concentration does not end the fight, it just adds another 20 minutes to it. That is the part that turns this into a genuine community argument. Is Longui actually hard, or is it just really, really long? Players optimize their party roles, their paradigm decks, their entire approach around squeezing maximum damage out of every stagger window, and the fights that go well are not the ones with clever last-second saves. They're the ones where nothing goes wrong at all, for the entire duration. Picture the guy on his couch at 2 in the morning, health bar down maybe a third, controller getting heavier in his hands, doing the math on weather. Bailing now means the last hour was for nothing. That is not a difficulty spike. That is an endurance test wearing a difficulty spike's costume. And that is where Longui quietly answers something every earlier fight only gestured at. The hardest a single-player superboss can possibly be is a perfect system understood and executed for long enough that your patience breaks before the boss does. But every fight so far shares one hidden mercy. You could always pause, walk away, and come back. The final wall took that away because it wasn't one player's ordeal anymore, it was an entire community's, and beating it meant a fight that spilled out of the game and into legend. Absolute virtue. One player was never the problem, an entire server was. That is the only way to explain what absolute virtue actually did to Final Fantasy XI. Every boss before this one, no matter how brutal, still came down to a single person deciding how much of their own life they were willing to hand over to a video game. Grinding gear, memorizing patterns, sitting on a couch at 2 in the morning watching a health bar refuse to move by even 1 pixel. That was the whole equation, every single time. One player, one will, one breaking point. Absolute virtue broke the equation itself. This fight demanded something none of the others did. Not talent, not patience. Coordination on a scale that meant dozens of players, sometimes entire communities, organizing around a single encounter that could no longer be soloed into submission through sheer stubbornness. The obvious read is that it was just a hard boss, another wall to grind against. The complete read is that it stopped being a fight you could lose alone and became a fight you could only lose together, which is a much scarier design decision than it sounds. That shift is what turned absolute virtue into folklore. Its reputation spread far past the players who ever actually stood in front of it. People who never touched Final Fantasy XI still know the name, still bring it up like it belongs to them too. That does not happen because a boss hits hard. It happens when a community spends years telling each other the same story until the story gets bigger than the game that created it. Memory did the heavy lifting that raw numbers never needed to do. And that is the part that makes every earlier boss in this video read differently now. The couch-bound grinder chipping away at one monster for one more hour was never really being tested by hit points or movesets. They were being tested on how much of themselves they would spend before finally walking away. Absolute Virtue just scaled that same question up from one person to thousands, and asked how long an entire community would keep showing up before somebody admitted defeat. Square Enix did eventually step in. Late in 2008, official patch notes knocked Absolute Virtue's health down from roughly $100,000 to around $66,000 and softened its stats right along with it. Outlets covered the change like a ceasefire being signed after a war nobody officially declared. But a nerf on paper does not undo years of a community insisting it had already found the real answer on its own terms, and the legend kept moving long after the numbers changed underneath it. The most powerful boss was never the one with the most HP. It was the one that stopped being a game you could win and became a story about how far a community would go before it finally gave up, and refused to. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.